What is inspiration, imbas, and what are inspired poems? Draíocht. I want to talk today about a little bit about imbas, which translates more or less as inspiration, and particularly Imbas Forosnai, which translates as inspiration that illuminates. A few days ago, I posted a poem called Sands of the Living. And that is a poem that I wrote in around 2008. And it was the direct result of an Amramic meditation that brought me to the Isle of the Ancestors, that led me to an ancestral encounter. And when I posted that poem, the reaction was very interesting and led to some really interesting discussions about imbas and inspired poetry. So in Irish poetic traditions, all poetry is revered. And ordinary, we might call it ordinary poetry, is seen as the result of, mastery of technique, skill, ability, and is prized. But then you have poetry of inspiration, and that is held to have come from a slightly different source. We may say divine inspiration, but it's more even than that. It is, you have the ancestral connection, you have the otherworldly connection, you have, you could say it came from nature and the land itself. So anything, any outside agency that provided inspiration, imbas, and created the poet. Now, that poem is still your work. It is your consciousness and your subconsciousness. It is your skill, your words, your style. It doesn't matter whether you wrote it in an old Irish poetic style or free verse or whatever style you used. What is important, though, is that they had the added element of inspiration from an outside agency. So it's not a replacement for skill and technique. If you have no skill as a poet and you get inspiration, what you'll produce is doggerel. It is literally an addition to long hours of practice and craft. Now, for someone who if you have no ambition to be a poet per se, imbas and seeking imbas is still very important spiritually, and also if you wish to speak on topics that perhaps you feel passionately about, it can add an added layer to that. So it's a spiritual, magical, social addition to what you're trying to say. And it doesn't matter if you're not a great poet. What matters is that you put effort into presenting the message as well as you can. You can't just throw it out there. That's rejecting the gift you've been given. You must put effort into it. Another aspect of this is the difference between what I'd call ordinary poetry and poetry of inspiration. Now, I can only speak personally. I have had poems that were critically acclaimed, that were published, that were the result of hard work. They were not poems of inspiration. I had something to say and I worked very, very hard at my craft to say it. And then I have poems that are definitely poems of inspiration, like Sands of the Living. And I have noticed personally a very different emotional response to poems that were, as I say, crafted perhaps in the normal way, and poems that were directly the result of seeking imbas, leaving space for inspiration and receiving it as I worked. And there is definitely a more emotional response, for good or bad, to those inspired poems rather than to the others. And as I said, there might be a more critical acclaim for the others, and that's not to say you won't also get an emotional response from the reader, but there is definitely, in my experience, a different element, an added response emotionally to the poems that are poems of inspiration. Now, in old Irish traditions, those poems were used for a variety of purposes. They were used for visualization of a possible future. They were used for prophecy of the likely future, or the inevitable future. And they're two very different things. There's the future that you're saying will happen, but there's also the future you're saying, well, if you do this, this will happen, and if you do that, this will happen. You're giving alternatives. They were used in rendering law verdicts. You would obviously have memorised the precedents, the law. You would know what was correct, but you were told to leave room for inspiration, that there should be the difference between like somebody who just knows the law and someone who is qualified to be like to administer the law is the ability to receive inspiration, that it's not just dry words and dry rules, that you allow for inspiration to come to you as you are rendering the verdict. And so it was a really important concept, and it's something worth looking at and evaluating within your own spiritual practice. And if you write poetry, I would particularly like to know about it, and I would also like to know to what degree do you find a different response to poems of inspiration, poems that are achieved through meditation, journeying, connection with the deity, connection with the land, and perhaps poetry that is more the result of craft and technique. Talk to you. Bye.